Hi, good morning. I've been asked to speak this morning about the evolution of community-based services in general and community-based services addressing the drugs issue in particular. And my presentation to you this morning has three parts: the past, the present and the future. And I'm going to start with the past because it's important in informing us where we are now and our current situation. Ireland has traditionally been an underdeveloped peripheral European society in which low priority has been given to welfare and with a limited vision of the role of civil society, by which I mean voluntary and community organisations, non-governmental organisations and NGOs. The 1960s, though, saw the beginning of voluntary and community-led responses to poverty and social exclusion, and you saw that in the movements against poor housing in Dublin and the early community development programmes of that period, or projects of that period. 1975 was a landmark, and again we owe it to Europe for bringing this in, the first programme against poverty, and it validated the idea, the concept of ground-based, research-based, bottom-up, community-led, policy-orientated campaigning responses. And that was formally endorsed in the report of that programme. The 1980s and 1990s, as you know, saw a substantial expansion of community-led initiatives, projects and responses, including those against drugs. And the last two words are important, which worked, because they did have definite results and outcomes for the communities in which they worked. The high point came in the period 1997 to 2002. The high point came because we had the National Anti-Poverty Strategy, introduced by Principes de Rossa in 1997, the White Paper supporting voluntary activity in the year 2000, which affirmed the independent role of the voluntary and community sector, its role against social exclusion, the idea that there would be liaison units in each government department to which voluntary and community groups would work, and further expansion and particularly support for the infrastructure of the voluntary sector. Plus a range of sectoral strategies, including, of course, the National Drugs Strategy, with implementation systems, making public administration much more sophisticated and effective in what it did, and the introduction of National Social Partnership. And in particular, you had the Combat Poverty Agency, which began in the mid-1980s, which funded national anti-poverty networks, small grant schemes, research grants, the capacity building of local and small groups with a programme of research, the Community Development Programme with 180 projects, advertised rightly to the rest of Europe as a flagship programme and a good model of how you do community development work. The Family Resource Centres, likewise, 106 of them. And the refining of policies against poverty, for example, child poverty. The agency showed that if you increase child benefit, you will reduce child poverty. And the government did, at least at that time, accept that advice, and no surprise, child poverty was actually reduced during that period. The problem is what happened in 2002 when we had what I call a strategic turn. And that took place in June 2002. I don't think I can recall any single, not a change of government when the same parties were re-elected to government, but which brought about greater political change than in the election that took place in May of that year. Funding for voluntary and community organisations was delayed and then reduced 47%. Research funding was scrapped altogether on the basis that we don't need any more expert reports. Voluntary activity units were not progressed, and we still don't have them, and we suffer because we don't, because it's difficult to open doors into some government departments. The policy unit for community development projects was actually scrapped within days of the two new ministers coming into office in the new Department of Community, Rural and Community and Rural Development. There was the removal of the funding role of the Combat Poverty Agency, all of which were hoovered into the new Department of Community Development and put under ministerial control there. So ministers decided exactly who got money and who did not. And that process also led on to the Charities Act of 2009, which was passed, but important sections relating to the voluntary sector were suspended. But what they did pass was a section which decreed that human rights were no longer a charitable field of activity, although they had been in the state up to that point. And there is increasing evidence of charities being refused charitable status, which is important if you want to get grants, on the basis that they also now do campaigning. And those are significant changes that have happened only in the past couple of years. With the breaking of the economic and social crisis, in 2008, and I don't use the word recession. Recession is the failure to achieve economic growth in more than 2 quarters in a row. I think we can agree that what has happened since 2008 is more serious than that. The Combat Poverty Agency was abolished. Other social agencies were extinguished. And it's interesting when we look at a list of those that have been extinguished. They are the National Council for Ageing and Older People. Its staff transferred into the Minister's Department to answer parliamentary questions. The National Economic and Social Forum, CORE, the Forum for Voluntary Organisations Working in the Environmental Area, the National Consultative Council on Racism and Interculturalism, the Office for Active Citizenship, the Homeless Agency, important advisory committees in the area of women's health, educational disadvantage and childhood development, the reduction, severe reductions in funding in both the Equality Authority and the Irish Human Rights Commission, and instead new economic agencies created, including the biggest one in the history of the state, which we all know and love as NAMA. The Community Development Programme was closed, including as part of that the Dublin Inner City Partnership, and limits were set to dissent as to what voluntary and community groups should do. Specifically look at clause 2.8 of the Standard Service Level Agreement issued by the HSE, which specifies that you may not follow courses of action designed to persuade people to follow a particular policy or practice. Why is it our Irish state is so terrified that people trying to persuade people to do something is considered a threat to them, but it is. Looking at the funding, if we look at overall funding, I'm going to move on a slide and then come back to this one. If we look at overall government spending, if I were to ask you how much do you think government spending has gone down in the past 5 years, the papers I think would lead us to believe that it's been an awful lot. But if we go onward, we find that the actual fall in government spending has not been that enormous. It's been minus 7.1% from 2008. It actually went up in 2009, as you can see, to 7.1% to 2014, next year's figures. But to come back for a second, there was never a formal statement from government that social policy spending would be particularly affected. But as we come and look in the figures more detail, that does appear to be what would happen. On the other hand, if we do look at the so-called Programme for National Recovery, it is very interesting that those spending cuts that are specified in the most detail are those that are in the social policy area. In practice, voluntary and community organisations have seen their funding fall by between -8 and -10%, not over 5 years, but over each year. So there's been a huge difference as to what has happened. The only commitment from government never said, and was never honest enough to say to us, we will reduce all social spending because, like some ideologists of the right, they believe in that. But instead, they only said, we will attempt to preserve frontline services. And that was the only definitive commitment that we got from government. If we look at the actual spend and the actual changes, we see some quite remarkable figures. And I ask you to bear in mind the minus 7.1% figure, because that's the baseline against which everything else should be measured. The Local and Community Development Programme down 43.3%, remember, against 7%, so it's 6 times higher than that. And it is due to be integrated with the local authorities on the 1st of July, so if we're having this meeting in a year's time, it will probably not even be on a chart because it'll be fully integrated into the local authorities. It will be gone like the Community Development Programme before that. Initiative against drugs, which obviously are the key concern and interest today, down minus 37%. And this, like the LCDP, a programme targeted to the most disadvantaged communities. And that is general government spending. The problem, though, is when we look at the statements issued from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform the other day, let's look at the more detailed headings because this is interesting. On the left-hand column, you see the current funding for those government departments that most fund voluntary and community organisations. In the middle column, you see the bottoming out next year. And at the right-hand column, you hope to see the gradual increase in 2016. But if anyone can see a figure on the right-hand column that is higher than a figure in the middle column, please tell me. Because we see, unfortunately, the conclusion from this is that when there will be a general rise in spending in 2016, social spending is not amongst those areas to benefit from that increase. So that increase will go somewhere else. And it's rather interesting that not only has government said that it's protecting frontline services, but that it is also protecting the poor. But let's look at the figures. And these are not my figures. These are the figures supplied by the Central Statistics Office in cooperation with the European Commission, and this is what's called EU SILC, or the European Union Standards of Income and Living Conditions. And it shows a very interesting thing. It shows the level of poverty, or the proportion of people below the 60% poverty line, declining until 2009. And you can see from 2009 it begins to rise again, with the proportion of people below the poverty line increasing from 14.1% to 16%. And it's even higher for children, and it's rather interesting furthermore that the rate of increase is higher than what has happened in Greece. Let's move on to the drug services, because I think this does invite the question of why reduce drug services. And you saw the minus 37% figure I put up to you a moment ago. Why reduce that so much? Because we know that local drug services lead to gains in health, in criminal justice, in policing and in employment. The Home Office in Britain estimates that there is between a 3-to-1 and a 9-to-1 cost-benefit positive outcome from these investments. And in terms of savings on other spendings. We know of gains deriving from local and community-based drug services, and it's worth maybe reminding ourselves of some of these arguments in just a moment, because they come from the Good Bodies review of the local drugs task forces in 2006. And we also know the consequences of cuts. So I know people here will be very familiar with this, but it is sometimes worth just reminding ourselves just how important these things are. The Good Body findings, okay, where that local services did lead to improved trust and cooperation with the Gardaí. The sources of supply were identified, that there was reduced drug use generally, and specifically the prevention of use by children. The teachers intervened more early and more effectively, that there was a challenge to open dealing, that more people became drug-free or stayed drug-free for longer, that there was a normalisation in their personal and community lives, that practical help and support was given to their families, which is all important, and there was a prevention of relapse. We know those were the concrete outcomes. And let's remember, we listen quite often to a government that speaks about evidence-based policy making. This is the evidence. And let us look at the consequences of cuts, which Citywide itself has documented. Fewer people using services, longer waiting lists, a higher prevalence of drug use, earlier addiction by children, more ill health attributable to drugs, including early mortality, a failure to stop supply and dealing, higher rates of crime, intimidation, antisocial behaviour, break-ins, a relapse by existing users, slower normalisation, a diminished ability of the Gardaí to respond, and a decline in the security and in the quality of life. That's the evidence. That is our evidence-based policy making. So how do we explain the cuts? And in this era of evidence-based policy making, they make no sense. I consider them to be literally irrational and anti-rational. Why, if all the evidence tells you that this is a good investment, government pulls the money from it? It makes no sense. It runs counter to all the European advice that is available. It runs counter to the approach of most European governments. Jacques Delors many years ago said that economic and social progress must advance together, hand in hand. The economic benefits the social benefits the economic. And I question, what is the coherence behind these cuts? You've seen the figures. Why 43% here, 30% there, 20% somewhere else? It's almost the throwing darts at a darts board and hitting a particular number. There's been never any explanation. And I would actually question how much the ministers concerned have been asked to explain the differentials in these different cuts. Okay? We can see that protecting frontline services is a falsehood when we go through the evidence that we've heard here. But there is an underlying implicit pattern against social policy and its institutions, so many of which, as you can see, have now been disbanded. An implicit pattern against voluntary organisations in general, if their funding is down 8 to 10% a year, which is more than the total government fall over 5 or 6 years. And against community-based organisations in particular, because the cuts in community-based services targeted at disadvantaged areas have been markedly and identifiably higher. I wonder, is an attempt to settle scores with civil society and voluntary organisations for maybe becoming too important, too outspoken, too articulate. The only consolation we can draw from this is that the attempt to remove voluntary and community organisations from the Constitution, and it was an attempt to remove them from the Constitution on the 4th of October, was defeated by the people. Let's look at the policy responses that have been made to this difficult situation. And there has been work done to try examine this and try confront this. And I think it's important that we be positive and look at the counter-arguments, the counter-narratives, the counter-evidence that has been presented in the face to what is being done by government. There is the impact research that has been done by the Congress of Trade Unions, by Harvey Point, obviously related to the travellers. There's the budgetary analysis done by the Wheel, done by Task, and done by the NARI Institute. Because they have presented alternatives and alternative approaches. They are there. They're there to be read, they're there to be studied, they're there to be presented to our political leadership. There have been challenges to these policies in the Oireachtas, principally by the independent deputies and senators and by Sinn Féin members as well, who have challenged government head-on a lot of these things. But if we look at the overall picture of how we responded in the voluntary and community sector, it presents a very wide picture, somewhere between passivity and defiance at the other end, in particular the Spectacle of Defiance parade led by St Michael's Estate Family Resource Centre. It's rather interesting, and this was a film shot that was shown on Channel 4, but not on RTE, when the Greeks are out marching, and of course they were chanting this in Greek, not in English. But the subtitles showed that what the Greeks were chanting were not the Irish, we're the Greeks, we do not capitulate. Okay? And that, I think, puts in some context the very different levels of response from our two countries. But there have been attempts to, and I think the other thing is there has been little traction for these counter-arguments in the media, where all that is happening is we've been portrayed as the unfortunate casualties of recession. The government had no other choice. You can see from the figures there are plenty of other choices. And alternative analysis and proposals have been presented through the Claiming Our Future movement and through academic analyses such as Mary Murphy's Second Republic. And those are the kind of counter-arguments that we should learn, we should read, and we should use as the basis for our argument for challenging and changing what has been happening to us. So just if we could look at some of the futures, this is my last slide. What we've seen, I think, is a quite unimaginable reversal from where we were in the year 2000, 2001. No one, that I know of anyway, anticipated the wave of destruction of our social and community development infrastructure that took place from June 2002, where Ireland was a European leader. As someone once said recently, no one saw this coming. And in doing that, we see a radical departure from the European social model. Isn't it interesting that the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Iveta Radičová, says that civil society must be at the heart of policy making in a modern democracy? How far have we got from little Slovakia in only 12 years? There's a working assumption that with recovery, all will be well again. This is highly questionable. Certainly the evidence is not in the figures. Certainly for us, all will not be well again in 2016. There is a real danger that austerity is set to continue for civil society and for social policy, a sort of post-austerity austerity. And I would also question, do we really want the Celtic Tiger model back? Because that seems to be the best that the government can come up with at the moment, is maybe kinder, gentler Celtic Tiger, but it's still a very unequal one. And I think it behoves us to start making the case, and hopefully we'll make that now with ever greater effectiveness, for a more enlightened, balanced European social model applied to Ireland with a strong role for civil society. Isn't it interesting that 100 years ago it was civil society organisations, voluntary and community groups that helped to build the new Irish state, particularly in 4 key areas. Housing, where Dublin 100 years ago had an appalling housing problem. Groups working in communities, in feminism, in the Irish language and in culture, and they helped to build a new state. It's also striking how there is no government plan for post-recovery, and it contrasts so dramatically with what happened and I'm going back into the history just for a last point, when Britain was besieged in 1942 on all fronts by Germany, Japan and the other Axis powers. What did it do? It said, right, we're at war, we start planning for the peace now. And in Britain was produced in 1942 at the height of the conflict, the Beveridge Plan, which said, we shall have, when this is all over, a modern welfare state. We shall have a National Health Service. And that lifted the expectations of not only the soldiers but all the people, which said we're never going back to where we were before. So let that give us heart as we move forward. Thank you very much.